When Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep in 1919, Thomas Marshall said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." Hello, today I will be discussing the history of my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm going to show how that quote sums him up pretty nicely. He was born October 27th, 1858, in the Grand New York City. He was born with asthma, but just decided for it not to affect him, and he pushed through and he became an absolute unit of a man. In his childhood, he was privately educated, but eventually he went to Harvard and graduated there, and he also did a brief stint at Columbia Law. But he sort of ditched law and instead went into politics, getting elected to New York State Embassy at only 23 years old. The year before, he married Alice Lee and had one daughter also named Alice. But that didn't last long, because on Valentine's Day in 1884, both his wife and his mother died. That's some bad luck if I've ever seen it. In reaction to this, he decided to briefly leave politics and go to his cattle ranch in the Dakota Territory, where he became a cowboy and acting sheriff. But in 1886, he would get married to Edith Caro, and over the years would have 5 children with her. A man is a machine. The same year, he tried to re-enter politics, but he didn't get elected as mayor of New York, so that's too bad, I guess. But only a few years later, he'd get elected as president of the New York State Commissioners. While there, he'd fight against corruption. In 1897, he would be appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President William McKinley during the Spanish-American War. During that war, as lieutenant colonel, he would lead a group of some of his football buddies from college and a group of actual cowboys called the Rough Rider into battle. They fought in the Battle of Santiago and had an amazing victory because they were being led by the Big TR, baby! Soon after this, he'd be elected governor of New York. He was suggested to run by the Republican bosses, but they soon started to dislike him because he decided to do good things, like stopping corruption and regulating corporations, and they didn't like that. In response, they were like, how the hell do we get rid of this guy from governing New York? So they decided what to them would be a horrible mistake, but for the rest of us was a blessing. And they chose to have him run for vice president for McKinley's second term, because vice presidents do anything. I'm sure nothing will happen from that. Yeah, little did they know that would lead to him seeing over a lot more than just New York. You know, like the whole country. Because soon after being elected, McKinley was shot, which made Theodore Roosevelt the new president. Also, the youngest president we've ever had at 42 years old. Some fun things he did were renaming the executive mansion to what we all call it now, the White House. He also had the most pets of any president while in office at around 40. Some of the more outlandish ones being a black bear, a badger, and a hyena? What? Speaking of Roosevelt and animals, in 1902 he went on a hunting trip, but he failed to kill anything, which leaded some people to tie up a bear, suggesting that he could kill it so he'd have a win. Roosevelt refused, rightfully believing that it was unfair and unsportsmanly to kill a defenseless animal all tied up like that. This story got fairly popular and led a toy maker to think about it, and he asked President Roosevelt if he could name this new stuffed bear he was making after him, and then the teddy bear was born. But more on his actual politics, he'd give these speeches called bully pulpits, where he'd educate people on such things as political corruption, needing to control trust, the U.S.'s involvement in world politics, and regulation of railroads. When workers at coal mines threatened to go on strike, which would have led to heating, not going to hospitals, schools, etc., Roosevelt knew he needed to do something about this because you can't just cut the heating to those places, but he also knew that the coal miners had a point. So Roosevelt told the coal mining companies that he was going to cut off their credit and send the army in to do the work if they didn't raise their prices. And thankfully, that worked. And the coal miners got a pay raise. But things really pick up after the 1904 election, which he won with 336 electoral votes. In the first year of this new term, he famously called for the creation of the Panama Canal, which created a much more efficient trade route and is still used today. And using no transition, football was very, very violent at this time. Some people were literally dying from playing it. Roosevelt was understandably upset about this, but he also, was a big manly man and he loved football. So he talked to football heads and rewrote the game so it would be able to be played without people getting seriously injured all the time. Around the same time, he established the Forest Service and he opened a bunch of national parks. In 1906, he was passing laws left and right. There was the Hepburn Act, which created regulation on railroads. He also passed, in my opinion, two of the greatest acts ever passed, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. These basically told people making food, this has to be edible and clean, so people, won't get poisoned. Roosevelt was also very focused on foreign policy with his famous ideology, speak softly and carry a big stick. The most important thing that came from the foreign policy was his intervention in the Russo-Japanese War. Roosevelt brought both nations to the Portsmouth Peace Conference, where he had them make agreements and ended the war, which led to him getting the Nobel Peace Prize. I've been very biased this whole video, so I'll try to put in something to show that I'm being, slightly more objective than I have been so far, and mention what is his biggest mistake. He imprisoned many soldiers of a black regiment without a trial for starting a riot and killing someone in the process. It's very likely some of these people were involved, but most of them likely were not. Yeah, that brings us to the end of his presidency. He promoted William H. Taft to be his successor and then abruptly went on a hunting trip in Africa for 10 months. Once he returned, however, he saw Taft's presidency and he had some issues with it and decided to run again in 1912. He lost the Republican nomination for presidency to William H. Taft, so he instead decided to run for a third party called the Progressive Party. While he was campaigning, he was shot. The bullet went through some layers of clothes, paper, and a glasses case he had in his pocket, but it still went into his chest and would have hurt like hell. He then told the audience, the hardest quote in all of history, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He then continued talking for 90 minutes before getting medical attention, and after this, the Progressive Party was known as the Bull Moose Party. Republican votes were split between Taft and Roosevelt, leading the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win the election, but it should be mentioned that Roosevelt got the most votes any third-party candidate has ever gotten. Other things he did before his death were writing an autobiography about how he nearly died from sickness in the Brazilian jungle, but survived. And also, when World War I broke out, he spoke out against Woodrow Wilson for not sooner joining the war and supporting the Allies. He also didn't like Woodrow Wilson for signing the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which limited free speech. But to conclude, in his life, Theodore Roosevelt was a Harvard graduate, state assembly member, cowboy, sheriff, police commissioner, assistant secretary of the Navy, lieutenant colonel, governor, vice president, president, and a Nobel Prize winner. That's crazy. But before I end this video, I want to mention how I said he was my favorite president earlier, which is true, but that does not mean I think he's objectively the best president. That's probably someone like Lincoln. It just means that I think he's really interesting to learn about. I think he did a lot of good things, but I still do acknowledge that he wasn't perfect and he made mistakes. That being said, comment down below who your favorite president is and maybe your favorite fact about them. Bye!